everyone, and welcome to another episode of Everyday Black History. Now, today on Everyday Black History, we're going to be highlighting a woman by the name of Jennie Dean. And Jennie Dean was born April 15th, 1848. Some sources say 1853. But she was born into slavery in Northern Virginia, freed as a result of the American Civil War, and she became an important founder of churches and Sunday schools for African Americans in Northern Virginia. But what's most important is that she founded the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth, which for more than 40 years was the only institution of secondary education available to African American youth in Northern Virginia, and one of only two in the state of Virginia that didn't have an overt religious affiliation, as many of the schools back then were connected to churches. But hers, she started on her own through fundraising and just, business people that she met throughout the years, getting them to fund her school and her dream of educating black youth. Now, just to give a little background information on her, she was born, as mentioned, April 15th, 1848 or 1853, depending on the source, and she was born into slavery. Her dad, Charles Dean, and her mom, Annie Dean, were both enslaved and owned by first the Newman family and later the Cushing family. After she came from a big family, many brothers and sisters, and after Virginia seceded from the Union and the American Civil War began, her Colonel Cushing, who was the patriarch of the family who owned her, his sons joined the Confederate Army, and after one of his sons died in battle in Virginia during the Civil War, the elder Cushing, the father, died as well. Now, there were two battles that were fought in Manassas, Virginia, and both of them were fought close to the Dean family's home. And she mentioned how during the Civil War they just stayed in their cabin. They stayed in their cabin and tried to remain free of artillery shells and crossfire because it was fought so close to where they lived. Because the Civil War was the only war that was actually fought on American soil. But on their master's instructions, they were ordered to rescue Confederate soldiers and bury the dead. They were ordered this from the Cushing family. But after the Civil War ended, Jennie Dean received schooling at a Manley school as a teenager in 1866, and she sought domestic work in Washington D.C., where she would take the train home on the weekends to be with her family. She spent most of her wages at home, which helped her family buy the farm that they wanted, and also to cope with her father's death, because, as mentioned, after the war ended, they were freed. But it also allowed her sister to even attend a seminary school, Wayland Seminary, and become a teacher. But Jennie Dean's idea to educate, the black youth came about as she saw many young African Americans. She saw that many of them can leave farming and the hopelessness of sharecropping and actually move to cities or maybe even own their own farms. And so she was concerned that moving to cities that they would be stuck in these low wage jobs or succumb to alcoholism or many of the other social ills that affected our people at the time. So she addressed the problem through one of the things through her faith when she helped to organize congregations. And by organizing these congregations, she was able to secure land to construct 4 different churches: Mount Calvary, the Prosperity Chapel, the Carpathian Chapel, and the Dean Divers Chapel. She was able to construct 4 different churches on land that she was able to secure through to address the problem of low wage jobs that would affect African Americans or even being sharecroppers. So she founded by 1878 she founded more than a dozen Sunday schools. And during that time, she would travel around Northern Virginia on the weekends in a horse-drawn carriage and offer African American youth instruction on what would later be called Victorian values. So this was the start of what would later be known as the Manassas School for Colored Youth. But she continued fundraising for Sunday schools and other improved activities during the winters. And she would go to different places like Washington, D.C., and even extended trips in New York City and Boston, Massachusetts, where she would make acquaintances with well-heeled people. One of the people she made an acquaintance with was the publisher of the New York Evening Post, who published a favorable biography on her and made many donations to programs that she advocated. He even became the chairman of the board of Manassas Industrial School of Colored Youth, which he formed later, and his name was Oswald Garrison Billard. Unfortunately, he'll become a problem for her later on, but we'll get into that a little later. But in Boston, she not only made his acquaintance, but she also made the acquaintance of other men like Edward Hale, who not only donated money but also opened social doors to Dean, and also Reverend Philip Brooks and his Episcopalian congregation. So the people that she met, she made these connections with, and she was able to get further funding for her Sunday schools and for her school later on. In 1890, her and her sister, Ella, and Jeannie E. Thompson, who was a white woman who supported educating African Americans, they decided to establish an industrial school in Manassas to serve African Americans in the 5 surrounding counties, and wanted to secure a farm near a railroad station because it'll mean more people will be able to come to the school. And they plan to teach the students useful skilled trades, as well as educate and inculcate values of hard work and thrift. It took, almost 3 years for them to raise the funds, but they were able to raise the funds and use it as a down payment for the land. And Jeannie Dean was invited to speak at women's suffrage conventions in Washington, and also while there, she met an heiress, Emily Howland of Sherwood, New York, and meeting her and talking to her and charming her like she did everyone else that she met, she was able to get the final $1,000 that she needed to finish paying for the farm and start building the first hall for which would become the Manassas School for Industrial Youth. And on October 7th, 1893, the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth received its charter, and it began to accept students the following fall. It was so big that even Frederick Douglass was among the speakers at the dedication ceremony that September. And in the school, they taught students they could study liberal arts as well as receive instruction in dressmaking, childcare, blacksmithing, cooking, carpentry, shoemaking, and even farming. Unfortunately, after about a year of the school being around in 1895, one of Howland Hall, which was the first hall, caught fire and burned down, so it had to be rebuilt. And several years later, in 1900, the boys' dormitory also burned down, which, as we know, was definitely suspicious. I mean, obviously, but despite these setbacks, the school prospered. Those burned down buildings were OG built. The school prospered, and they received grants from people like Andrew Carnegie and other rich Americans during that time that gave donations to the school. And on February 14th, 1906, Jeannie Dean was able to even visit the White House with several of her students to meet President Theodore Roosevelt at the invitation of Booker T. Washington, whom was favorably compared to Jeannie Dean by the President Theodore Roosevelt. Unfortunately, as mentioned, one of the first people to support her, Oswald Garrison Billard, he worked hard to push out Jennie Dean from the school, and by claiming mismanagement of money on her part. But Jeannie Dean complained about Oswald Billard's sexism and his neglect of local donors and interests for the black students that was there, and he had these grandiose plans to revamp the institution and turn it into another Tuskegee Institute. So there was a back and forth between them that came about later on, where he actually ousted her from the board from her own school that she created. But meanwhile, but even still, unfortunately, her health deteriorated after a stroke, and she became confined to her home. And after suffering another stroke on May 3rd, 1913, she died because of her ailments. But as we know, her legacy lives on. As mentioned, the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth continued on for decades. It produced many teachers and other leaders of the African American community. And as mentioned, it was only one of two schools that wasn't related to another religious denomination. And during the 1950s, the school continued on during the 1950s, and after the Board of Education versus Brown, that case in the 1950s when segregated schools were pretty much relegated obsolete. The Manassas School of Industrial Youth closed afterward in 1959 because there was no need for segregated schools. But as mentioned, her legacy lives on. There are parks, there are schools named after Jennie Dean to show how much she affected Black history and Black culture and just culture as a whole, because of her work to educate Black youth during a time when there was no avenues for education for us. So, Jennie Dean, we thank you for your contribution to Black history and Black culture, and we salute you for it. As mentioned, there's a lot more information on her and about her school. We've done episodes on Manassas School of Colored Youth on Everyday Black History, and now we're highlighting the founder. So do yourself a favor and look her up, look up information on her, because her contribution is very, very deep as far as what she contributed to Black history and Black culture. But definitely stay tuned for the next episode, as we'll be coming at you soon.